Hello there. I've been a big fan and longtime supporter of Star Citizen. I'm an original backer, have concierge status, and definitely want the game to succeed. Okay, yada 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 yada, you know the rest. Let's get started. Oops, that's actually iconic. This is more like it. Star Citizen has been a large part of quite the personal journey for me, which is a bit of an odd thing to say considering it's not even released yet and more than likely won't be for at least a couple more years. This is the type of thing you'd normally hear at the close of a game's life when support was ending and the servers were being shut down. But that's just how strange this whole project has become. Star Citizen continues to have its highs and lows, successes and failings, and will most likely have many more as the studio continues work on the game. I decided to make this video essay not only as an introspective and critical look at my support of the project, but also as a way to take others through how Star Citizen started, how has it changed over the years to become everything the game, and why I really no longer am able to support the project. I suppose I best say that you, dear viewer, should keep in mind that while I will be giving a factual recounting of Star Citizen's history, large portions of this video are going to be based on my opinion. While I like to believe that my opinion is well-reasoned and correct, I could be wrong. So with that out of the way, it's time to get stuck into this mess. Part 1, in the beginning. It was 2012 and the Kickstarter boom was really starting to set in. This time period seemed especially full of independent game developers hoping to fund smaller game projects that weren't really being taken on by big publishers. And just as a side note, Star Citizen may have incidentally started the Kickstarter burnout that has set in and stuck the past couple of years, especially for PC games. It had been a couple years that I was primarily into playing games on the PC after being able to afford a rig better than the family Best Buy box that could only handle World of Warcraft on low. I was exploring all of the nice things this platform could offer, and part of that was seeing all the different Kickstarter campaigns for small games, most of which had at least mildly interesting premises. It seemed very odd to me that publishers thought there wasn't a place in the market for these smaller games, especially on the quote-unquote open platform master race, after hearing all of the talk on propaganda websites like these. Despite there being a lot of interesting little projects out there looking for support, I was disappointed in the lack of sci-fi or space-related titles that were even semi-relevant to the current generation, on Kickstarter or otherwise. Even my old peasant boxes had one of the best sci-fi games ever made on it. So imagine my excitement when Chris Roberts comes strutting along with his new pitch for a game, and even had a nice looking prototype to go with it for the time. Here was a new game that was giving people both a single player story you could play with friends, a fun sounding multiplayer component, and even private servers with mods. The announcement for this game came hot off the heels of another space game I backed earlier in the year called Starlight Inception, that I could already see, even by that stage, was not going to turn into something very good. Oof. Chris Roberts, on the other hand, had a prototype that actually looked pretty promising and something they could build from, especially for what was, at that time, an indie project. The crowdfunding campaign also capitalized on Star Citizen being a true PC game, again, quote-unquote. Something that was meant to push graphics hardware. You could think of it as the next Crysis. These selling points fit what I, and I believe many others, were looking for from games on the PC almost perfectly. At that time, the only thing we could largely expect from the majority of publishers were ports from console games, and sure, we did get the occasional title where developers actually thought about the PC platform, like CD Projekt Red and The Witcher 2, as well as Deus Ex Human Revolution the previous year, either developing specifically for the platform or putting in optimizations that catered to it. But these games were few and far between. So here was an old, successful PC developer, Chris Roberts, returning to make PC gaming great again, as it were, and in a very neglected genre that was just waiting for a breath of fresh air. I was sold pretty much instantly, and so were thousands of other people.
Apparently, our site is having millions of hits and is overloaded, so everyone out there, please be patient. We'll try and get it back up.
While the original goal was to raise $2 million on Kickstarter and cover the rest of development costs through private investors, the end of the original campaign saw Chris Roberts surpass $6 million in funding. And it is here, already, that the first inklings of problems start to creep out from the shadows. Part 2. Runaway Funding. Because of the runaway success of the crowdfunding campaign, it was decided to leave funding options open to people through Cloud Imperium Games' own website, for those who either found the project late or wanted to increase the amount of money they invested into the project and purchase more ships. At this stage, that really only seemed like a good thing. More funding meant that the project would need to rely less on private investment, or that additional money would allow the project to improve in different ways, such as building an in-house motion capture studio, expanding into bigger office space, or even featuring a full orchestral score and creating a professional sound studio. These types of extra goals are great. They improve upon the original scope of the game in meaningful and noticeable ways to the player, without drastically expanding the amount of work that needs to be done to release the game. This runaway funding is eventually where the big problems started. In the original campaign, Star Citizen and Squadron 42 were a bit ambitious, punching above their weight class for the amount of funding sought from the public, but they were achievable. At least, I believe they were. The story campaign was a more reasonable 30 missions, multiplayer sounded ambitious, yeah, especially compared to the more traditional stuff I was used to with games like Halo and traditional multiplayer environments, or even an MMO setting like World of Warcraft. But the scale that was originally sold to the public was at least pitched as something that seemed possible for the funding. And this is keeping in mind that Chris Roberts had super secretive private investors that were lined up to make sure this ambitious project had the money it needed. All seemed well, but then... When I was writing this script, I was shocked all over again while looking at the number of big features being added to the project without any real thought as to how much it might actually cost to make them, or how it would affect the production of the game, much less the actual gameplay implications. On one hand, for an extra $1 million, players would get a new spacesuit added to their character. Then, for an additional $1 million each, CIG would add a brand new, big ship class like a frigate or battlecruiser. And judging by the amount of time spent on the 3 prominently featured capital class ships so far, I would wager those cost a lot more than $1 million to create. But I mean, who knows? Maybe paying for a huge department dedicated to creating capital ships in a studio of 100 plus employees over multiple years while not fully finishing one of the models, let alone even all the game systems and mechanics that go with it to 100% completion, stays under $1 million. I mean, what do I know? The problem CIG runs into here is that they seem to have written these different stretch goals simply because they sounded good on a list, as achievements for the community to unlock, rather than things that give meaningful improvements to what was the base version of Star Citizen. Almost double the number of single-player missions that was originally planned without double the amount of funding? Sure, why not? I bet we can afford it. How about a bunch of extra ship stations and new game mechanics we didn't think of or plan for in the foundation of the game? Yeah, we can figure it out later. Throw them in. This type of cavalier attitude plays directly into management of this project, but we'll get into that later in the video. These days, the call from CIG to have the community give them more and more funding is getting patronizing, to put it mildly. Downright scummy if you want to be brutally honest. continuing to find more ways to sell ships that were supposed to be limited, exclusive ships locked to crazy expensive hardware from Intel, a tank that is directly stolen from a Polish prototype, and then even going so far as selling land claims. These land claims, by the way, are a laughable attempt to sell land in a space game, while being able to technically say they aren't selling land. If you're willing to be the least bit critical and honest about this project, you'll just admit that yeah, CIG is selling land in the game. You can be fine that they're selling it, but I would question where your priorities for this, I repeat once again, space game, as in game you are supposed to be primarily traveling around outer space, are placed. And this is not even mentioning some of the frankly very anti-consumer things the studio has started doing. You know, those things they wanted to avoid doing by not working with those evil publishers? Like attempting to sell $20 virtual tickets to watch their annual CitizenCon event stream, trying to emulate Blizzard despite not even having released a single game yet. Luckily, they've walked that back. Or encouraging people to buy their subscription to access a test build of the 3.0 alpha after a year-long content drought of updates. Or how about not adding the ability to rent ships you don't own in the game yet by using credits you earn through playing the game to try them out and, actually test them? I thought this was supposed to be a pre-alpha. How are we supposed to do all of this invaluable testing? CIG claims helps them fix problems faster if we don't have access to all the content. Where is the pre-alpha? Whether or not these many issues are happening because CIG is constantly on the verge of financial collapse, I really have no idea. Various guesses have been made by piecing together aspects of financial information that have been made to the public, such as their loan in the UK, which may or may not implicate troubles. Some people have said that because they're continuously hiring people, that this means that they are in a perfect financial state. But as we saw, unfortunately, with the Telltale Games situation, that's not always the case. It really depends on who you ask. That seems legit. The short is that Star Citizen has become one of the most expensive games ever produced in the gaming industry, let alone the indie scene. And it has left them with some very large questions to answer, such as, can this even be made? Part 3. Can we even make this thing? Okay, so we've looked at the bigger picture of what Star Citizen was supposed to be from the start, as well as alluded to just how much the project has ballooned over the years of unchecked funding, with the majority of the community supporting the expansion for the most part. It's time to examine if CIG seems like they are actually capable of such a feat. The biggest and most glaring potential problem from the project's launch was the environment Chris Roberts had chosen to develop the game in, CryEngine. I personally had faith in the engine during the original crowdfunding campaign, but others were already expressing concerns about the choice of the engine, even at that early state. And these people turned out to be the correct ones. CryEngine has been nothing but problems for the development of the game, causing the studio to make so many changes to the engine they even stopped calling it CryEngine at one point, instead issuing their own branding of Star Engine, something that may actually be getting them into some legal trouble. And now even switching to Amazon Lumberyard, a fully licensed and now independently developed derivative of CryEngine. Even now with CIG struggling to get basic rendering techniques into the engine, should be a warning sign that this is going to be a technical nightmare, even with all of this frankly basic technology being implemented. But before doing some research on CryEngine, I had no idea that this was a much more limited and smaller scope engine, and was probably willfully ignorant of its capabilities during the initial early stages of the game's development. For the original game's scale, CryEngine seemed like it would have sufficed, especially before I did any research on it. As the project's scale moved further and further away from the original pitch, more issues became a large development hurdle. From the arduous process of converting it to a 64-bit platform, changing the camera system so the models are exactly the same in both first and third person, the massive networking issues still not addressed as of writing, and inability, no matter the power of your system, to get even close to a playable frame rate unless you get super lucky on a server for a while, allowing for proper testing of how movement, flight and combat feel in the game. Creating their own engine probably would have been the better option. However, that would have required the project to have a clear starting and ending point to their development plan, which either never existed in the first place or was thrown out the window the same time the crowdfunding money train came rolling into the station. If we know anything about the games industry, we know this. Graphics sell video games. The reason CryEngine was chosen to build the prototype of Star Citizen for the crowdfunding pitch wasn't because it could have worked in the original scale. It was picked because out of the box, the game engine has a more realistic rendering style, helping to sell that realism and high fidelity look Chris wanted. Also, Crytek, the developers of the engine, allegedly paid for the creation of the assets and demonstration level used in the crowdfunding pitch as part of a partnership deal with Roberts and his new game studio. This concept of graphics sell is proven time and time again where companies make things look as pretty as they can in promo materials, but then end up downgrading them for the actual release once pre-orders have been made, so the game actually runs properly. And downgrading itself isn't even inherently a problem for me. I would much rather play a game that feels fluid to control and has a consistent frame rate over something that is choppy. The problem is when it is used for manipulative marketing, which is something we will expand upon a bit in a later section. Even with all of the flashy things Star Citizen tries to sell itself on, looking back at the original material for the game, compared to whatever current version of the lighting and ship models we're on now, the first demo of the game actually looks quite dated. Even a lot of the current assets, while they do look very good, aren't really next-gen looking anymore. This is a symptom of any game that goes for a hyper-realistic looking art style. It just doesn't really age well. Other games have been catching up, while Star Citizen wallows in development hell. Even consoles are to the point where the best looking games there are comparable to this PC-only title, something I never would have expected to even consider saying back during the original funding campaign. But at the same time, these early videos from Star Citizen were enough to get people excited for how good it looked, and the way the game looks now is enough to keep people excited, despite the fact that high fidelity graphics don't make a fun game. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm obviously aware that it is impossible to completely plan out the development of pretty much any large project, much less a video game. However, any plans that Roberts and CIG had established when they were working on the original strategy for the project seem to have been tossed aside, possibly because of the community's demands. With that said, while crowdfunded games are sometimes at the mercy of their audience more so than traditionally developed games are, they still need to be able to establish what they want to create, and be able to say no to the community when things are bad ideas, don't fit the vision for the game, or when they are too time-consuming or expensive to make. We've seen examples of this in other projects as well. A theme of Star Citizen's development is that Chris Roberts seems incapable of saying no to features. That's why earlier I referred to the project as everything the game. Every type of gameplay that is in existence, from RPG and survival mechanics to system simulations, FPS mechanics, horror elements, minigames, walking simulator style exploration, Minecraft-esque building, everything seems to be planned as part of the game. There is no type of game that Star Citizen doesn't seem to want to include parts of. And I can see the appeal of why one would want to do this. You're creating a space sandbox where players have freedom to do what they want and tell their own stories. So, you want to give them as many tools as you can to do that. But there must be some limits. You need to say, okay, here's the final list of features we can make in a reasonable time frame, and ship that. It seems that Roberts has forgotten that this thing called DLC exists, or even better, game expansions, where you make a fun base game, and then later in its life cycle you release more content that people happily pay for because they want to keep having fun in the game they really enjoy. Blizzard has been doing this with World of Warcraft for over a decade now, and Roberts loves to talk about how Star Citizen will be actively played and expanded upon a decade after release. Part 4. Christ Roberts. You may have noticed that a lot of my criticisms relate back to good old CR. If you're not that familiar to the project, let me fill you in real quick. Chris Roberts is supposed to be the savior of PC gaming, which he does through the best PC game ever created, that being Star Citizen. There's a reason that Christ Roberts, may he save us all, is a meme within the Star Citizen community. That's exactly how he behaves as head of the development studio. Every decision, from design to art production, seems to go past Chris, taking micromanagement to the next level. And okay, if you have the talent and unique vision of the designers that were behind, say, Blade Runner, Aliens, or Star Wars, then yeah, I could see how that would be a positive thing. Roberts, however, is not as big a visionary as he likes to think he is. The general design of most things currently in Star Citizen are, well, for the most part, interesting, very derivative of other designs in the sci-fi space, with little to nothing that I personally see becoming an iconic staple of the genre. With Roberts steering the metaphorical ship, while also supervising and giving instructions to every other person doing a job on the ship, and apparently slaving away on his own coding projects, you can see how things might get slightly inefficient. Keep in mind that Chris was out of the industry for over a decade before coming back to create a brand new game. He made his successful Wing Commander games, then moved on to new projects such as Starlancer, Freelancer, and started to try and produce movies in Hollywood. A couple of those were alright. Most weren't. And his attempt to be more creatively involved as a director bombed quite badly. Roberts' seeming inability to manage a modern game studio is, I feel, quite apparent, even from just looking at the things they publish publicly, but also corroborated by employees who worked on the project. One artist wrote a long expose about his experience at the company with Roberts, delving into some details about how the normal industry standard practices work, how Roberts liked to manage his project, and why it doesn't work. It's a really fascinating read if you're interested in game development or a creative industry process in general, especially from an artistic perspective, something that I can relate to from my own past projects. Kotaku UK had a massive investigative article a while back, looking into the current state of the project, the studio, and people working within it, detailing a lot of the problems they are currently facing, which corroborates my statement about Roberts' inability to manage a development house. The issues with the game's progress isn't solely on CR's shoulders, however. The Star Citizen community often seems all too eager to defend every move the studio makes, while other heads working in departments of the studio have some questionable credentials. Ben Lesnick being in the position he is, having influence over ships and their conception, despite having no experience with game design, is definitely an odd one. Sandy Gardner being the company's head of marketing and VP, despite seemingly not having done any marketing before this project, is also quite curious. Well, after 6 years, the company may have figured out how to sell as many ship JPEGs as possible to their player investors. It is my professional opinion, as someone who actually works in the marketing industry to some capacity, that the company has made many easily avoidable missteps and faux pas along the way that have hurt the project's perception among the wider gaming market. Now, if you decided to guess that the simplest answer for these seemingly unqualified people holding the positions they do is nepotism,
I've been working with Chris for a long time.
Long time.
I have been working with Chris for a long time.
Yeah, you'd probably be right. Sandy Gardner is married to Roberts, and Lesnick has been a Chris Roberts superfan for probably about 2 decades. And while I only named 2 people, other leading figures in the company seem to maintain their positions because of their dedication to Chris, or are having their abilities squandered. That doesn't mean every department head working for CIG is poorly placed or holding their job because of loyalty, however. Far from it. And that's only just speculation on my part too, based on public videos that they've released. In fact, Chris's own brother Aaron is, in my opinion, the biggest reason the project is actually making the amount of progress that it is. As someone who started early in the games industry and stuck with it over the years, eventually heading the studio Traveler's Tales, while Chris went off to try and make Hollywood films, Aaron actually knows how to produce a game on a schedule and within a budget. Once again, I'm just speculating on all of this, of course. But if I could have an unfiltered look at the day-to-day workings of CIG, based on my knowledge of how creative industries work, I would not be surprised one bit if this is what the dynamic was like. At the end of the day, however, While there may be talented people who lead a studio or one of the many departments, everything leads back to Chris Roberts. When one person has such control over every aspect of a company, especially on a project as sprawling as this, the people that know what they're doing never get a chance to fully shine and put their best work forward. Instead, they're told to start changing already existing and mostly finished projects or tech because Roberts was playing a game recently and saw it was doing something interesting or better than Star Citizen, and he has to have it too. Honestly, it's kind of hard to blame the guy. When you tout your game as being the most advanced, best looking thing that is coming to market, but then deliver visuals and tech like this, when a console is delivering in-engine visuals that look like this, it's probably hard not to feel a little self-conscious. Is it worth taking people off their current work to try and keep up with every new development other games are doing? No, of course not. That's an unsustainable strategy. It does, however, seem to be what Roberts is doing, at least partially. There's a reason almost every MMO on the market doesn't even come close to the visuals of smaller scale games. Their time and development energy are put into other, more critical areas. Worse, when developers are allegedly telling Chris that some options aren't going to work in their game for X reason, but because he liked it and saw it in better games, those developers have to spend months of their time trying to make it work in Star Citizen just to prove to Roberts that it doesn't work. Instead of, listening to the workers that have been in the industry in recent years and actually know what they're talking about, not coming back to it after their career in Hollywood didn't work out. I am going to reiterate that I don't think the blame falls completely to Chris Roberts, although it really should considering the way he has chosen to run his studio. All the other senior development heads are responsible for keeping feature creep and technology bloat in check as well. While it's reported that Roberts is quite the diva when it comes to management style, meaning you do things his way or you find a new job, if all his senior staff put their feet down, what's he gonna do? Fire all of them? Oh god, he probably would do that, wouldn't he? All of this endless enabling of feature creep and scope bloat by managers and the fans alike has led to quite the mess of a project. Part 5. This mess of a project we're in. Just because Chris Roberts believes himself to be the god's gift to PC games, meaning everything is to be done his way, doesn't mean only he and his staff are to blame for the current state of the game's development. While it shouldn't always be this way, ultimately Roberts is still beholden to the people who are giving him sickening amounts of money to keep the production train rolling. The Star Citizen community was, when I first joined back in 2012, quite the nice place to connect and converse with people who were also excited about the project, as well as various hobbies that are generally found in common among nerds who like space games. As with any community, as it grows, things become more unwieldy and difficult to manage, but on the whole, things were fairly good. The forums started as an engaging place to discuss ideas, how the game development was progressing, and the design of the game mechanics CIG was publishing documents about. Respectful criticism and discussion could be had, and actually did result in positive changes with some things that appear to be oversights from CIG. As the project continued to grow, however, what was once a welcoming community fell further and further into the stereotype of any general gaming community. CIG felt the need to tighten up on some things like criticism, introducing the concerns section, where basically any topic they felt was a little too critical of the project would be moved to, out of sight and out of mind for most users. Even this very civil thread where users were discussing their current concerns for the project was closed because their conversation had run its course. Remember the way I started this video? I'm an original backer, have concierge status, and definitely want the game to succeed. If you're not too familiar with the project, you probably wouldn't recognize this as a joke. But for those of us who do try and raise legitimate concerns or criticisms of the game, people are first expected to grovel and plead to the community about how much they believe in and support the game in order to have a chance at being heard. And honestly, the amount of pushback you get in the Star Citizen community, whether it be on their own community platform, Reddit, or even my old guild for that matter, for daring to give legitimate concerns about the project is staggering.
The things that they promised in 2012, quite frankly, aren't exactly relevant anymore. Things change. We had no idea that we were going to get procedural planets. The promise isn't even for procedural planets. It's for them to look into the possibility of it. They looked into the possibility of it. Guess what? 2 weeks later, you've got a procedural planet.
People who are true believers, a term coined by Star Citizen detractors similar to White Knight, are so quick to dismiss anyone as a troll or goon for thinking that CIG may be doing some things wrong, are creating a huge echo chamber that allows CIG to continue perpetuating bad project decisions. Things that most people would rail on other companies in the game industry for doing are seen as a good thing for Star Citizen. That is not to say there aren't trolls or professional detractors, by the way, people who simply enjoy trying to rile up the fans of the project. But my personal anecdote from following this project for 6 years has shown that those people are incredibly outnumbered by those who defend every action by CIG. Why is this? Opposing sides like this, especially on the internet, is nothing new. I'm sure most everyone can remember how, as stupid as they are, console wars were and remain a thing to this day, at least to a degree. In a way, the Star Citizen is a scam back and forth debate is an extension of that console wars mentality. But where the question of which console is better is usually a pretty subjective stance to take because of variables like controller preference, game availability and exclusives, and ownership within your friend network, CIG has made demonstrable mistakes and spread lies of varying degrees to the point where it's no longer subjective. There's a lot of psychology and the human ego that comes into play when looking at issues like this. While I freely admit that I'm not a psychologist, it is a topic that greatly interests me, and so reading about and researching how things may play into the Star Citizen debate is something that I've spent a good amount of time doing. Depending on a person's level of involvement within the Star Citizen community, interest in psychology, or even just business in general, you may have come across the term called sunk cost. For the uninitiated, a well-known paper written by Hal Arks and Catherine Bloomer, entitled The Psychology of Sunk Cost, is one of the larger bodies of work done on the subject. The hypothesis is, individuals will often continue to pour resources into already started projects, because to abandon a struggling one they have already invested heavily into would be perceived as wasteful or a mistake by others. The authors claim that their experiments support the hypothesis of there being a widespread tendency for people to honor sunk costs. I find their evidence to be quite compelling, but make sure you go and read their study to learn more. It's linked in the description. I would like to believe that at my height of support for this project, I managed to keep some level of critical thinking skills. But it can be easy to want to defend something you are so invested in and dismiss legitimate flaws or mistakes. The human ego is an important aspect of our existence, and believing that we are able to make the correct decisions and not be wrong is what helps maintain our sense of self-worth and esteem. When we're wrong, we risk damaging our view of ourselves. A person that is honoring sunk costs can allow themselves to tell a more flattering story about their choices. I couldn't have been wrong to invest as much as I did into this project. Spending all that money was totally justified and worth it. I'm part of the concierge club. Look how special I am. I definitely made a good decision here. All those other people must be wrong. I have access to the Million Mile High Club. I'm special! Fuck. This ties in perfectly with the situation a Kickstarter game can have on a person's ego. Spending $10 or $20 on something that ended up being bad is easier to move on from. Sure, it was unfortunate to lose out on that money, or that the project didn't turn into a good product. But most people are going to move on quickly. However, Star Citizen actively encourages sinking more money, and thus psychological investment, into the project by marketing to the player that, while you could just spend $45 on the game, wouldn't it be better to have one of these more recent concept ships with better art and objectively superior ability to perform game mechanics? Just as a side note, power creep in ship designs has been happening for a while now, and the mantra about a starter ship being able to take on a more expensive ship doesn't really seem to be part of the design anymore. And it makes me sad. Now, I already know one of the counter arguments to this practice some people would make as to why it's okay or even good that CIG continues to sell concept ships. Because it is the same bad faith argument that people make to defend anti-consumer practices from other game companies. That is, no one is forcing people to buy more ships. It's their money, and if CIG wants to sell more ships and people want to buy them, why not allow it? Okay, sure, hypothetical person in the comments. Technically speaking, no one is directly forcing people to give CIG their money. I suppose you are correct. CIG isn't directly going to people's houses and robbing them of their cash. That doesn't mean what they're doing isn't wrong. Someone could con you into giving them a significant amount of your money, but because you handed it over willingly to the con artist, does that make it okay that the person took your money? By this argument's logic, yeah, you gave it to them, it's fine. What CIG is doing, without getting into a lot of the science and degree level theory, because that's a whole different video, and what a lot of marketing in general does, is take advantage and manipulate psychological triggers people have to different types of stimulus. People are affected by these things to varying degrees, from not at all to quite severely. While we have seen the term whales appear in the last few years within the industry, this type of person isn't new. In fact, they've listed at least as long as marketing has. It's just taken until the last few years for the games industry to figure out methods to exploit these people with these tendencies. It is similar but not directly related to people who suffer from gambling problems and how they are affected by things like loot boxes. Sure, it's technically their choice to spend more money than they should on loot boxes, but I mean, not really. Exploitation and ethical treatment of people who are being marketed to is a real issue, and something that anyone who works in or touches that industry needs to be aware of and considerate of, myself included. If your argument comes down to, people are saying what I'm doing is wrong or unethical, but it's not illegal, so that means it's okay. You might, just maybe, have a bad argument. Just maybe. I could continue on about how CIG fosters a community of people where the more you have spent on the game, the more prestige you have. How the promise of revolutionary multiplayer helped me justify spending far more money than I should have on big multi-cruise ships. However, time can be just as valuable a sunk cost investment to people as money, and for a lot of superfans, they're investing heavily with both. I believe it's not only the amount of money a person has spent on the game that determines a person's willingness to defend the bad business practices of CIG. The more you've spent above the base price of the game, it stands to reason the more likely you are to engage with the development and the community. When the seeming majority of a community surrounding a troubled project like this is so willing to accept anything the studio puts out, that's when you start getting things like this. I mean, come on, guys. They were selling land in a space game without even knowing how these mechanics would work or even close to when they were going to be implemented into the game. Can you imagine the backlash this kind of thing would cause if a company like Electronic Arts tried pulling it? One can argue, and I suppose technically they are correct, that even with this kind of blind loyalty, it's still in CIG's power to not listen to the echo chamber and do the right thing by being self-critical of their own work in important areas. They don't need the community to keep them accountable. It's completely possible they could just not sell over 100 ships and variants to people, often costing hundreds of dollars, and marketed towards people as the best way to play the game how you want, while all trying to hide behind the player choice and completely optional excuses we've come to expect from the games industry. Because we all know how well that goes when we give corporations the freedom to make the right choices in the best interest of the people, right guys? Right guys? This is of course not meant to characterize every follower and fan of the Star Citizen project in this light. Not at all. There are plenty of people who have only spent $45 on the base game and check in a couple times a year to see how the project is doing. If you're not someone who behaves in this way when people criticize or question the developer's intentions, then this does not apply to you. The number of people who do engage in this white knighting behavior has somewhat diminished over the time that I've been slowly writing this video as well. Continued disappointment with the updates CIG has released after spending so much time polishing, as well as continual pushback of critical improvements in systems, does finally seem to be having an effect on the community at large. Maybe not on the scale that I think is warranted, but at least to a degree. With that said, each major patch continues to get smaller and smaller, as Vital Technology CIG said was near completion a year ago is still not delivered. If this keeps up, who's to say if people will continue to keep going to bat for the company and defend the continued delay of deliverables? So it seems like we're in a pretty rough spot, aren't we? A studio trying to make a game that has every type of gameplay in it, led by a man who is out of the industry for a decade and doesn't seem to understand how to best implement a vision in the modern climate, let alone even decide on one for his game. And all followed by a community with many complacent enablers, loving all of the terrible decisions as much as the good ones that they make. The project is way behind schedule.
And the end of this year is going to be Squadron 42.
Though that may be tough since we won't really start working on it for at least 2 more years.
Threatened by a serious lawsuit, using technology that doesn't seem fit for the job, the latest Foundation patch, released by CIG, has yet to resolve long-standing issues that were meant to be fixed in a 3.0 patch that had a full year for polish and bug fixes, and has an apparent never-ending need for funding. And that's only scratching the surface of the amount of bad decisions, poor design,
the f***ing insurance mechanic, this patch. And they haven't fixed any of the other problems with people griefing. So now you're slowly, ever so slowly, gonna lose money. For example, so they just pad rammed me. Now it's a race between my patience and my credits versus their patience and their credits. So congratulations, Chris Roberts. The griefers have now won.
and other controversies that have happened so far. Where can things go from here? We got a conclusion. Where can things go? I don't even. I don't. First of all, no, we have enough ship JPEGs that are nowhere near art completion, let alone have even had their gameplay mechanics thought about yet. Second, despite listing a great many problems with Star Citizen and its current mess, as well as leaving tons more out, I don't necessarily think everything is all doom and gloom, that it's a type of scam where the studio heads will eventually run off with the money, or that some of what CIG is trying to achieve is completely impossible. I believe in their pursuit of success, they let the reins of the project get way away from them. Now left with the massive expectations for the game they allowed to flourish, it would be really awkward to try and pull those reins in and admit they lied so many times. It shouldn't be up to me or any of the other people who critique the project to come up with solutions that will help solve the problems plaguing the game. Chris Roberts was the one that came to us and said he knew how to make it all work, not the other way around. However, in an effort to try and be extra fair to the project I followed for so long, I have a couple suggestions. First things first, tighten the reins on the features. Yeah, it'll be awkward and embarrassing for the studio to have to backtrack on old promises and lies that they made, but my opinion is that the scope is so large right now that it is impossible to get a solid foundation for the game set in stone and working because they are trying to do everything at once. It's like trying to install a kitchen appliance while the foundation for the house is still trying to be laid. You can see symptoms of this happening with things like their networking backend infrastructure, and they're even still trying to get basic rendering techniques into the engine. It's been delayed over and over, and even more recently pushed out of the upcoming 3.3 update after it was pushed out of 3.0, 3.1, and 3.2 because they still can't get it working. Technically, they've put it in an incremental patch called 3.3.5, but having followed this project for as long as I have, I know that's their marketing department giving them a little bit more time to work on the tech without saying they've delayed the release yet again.
But another important aspect of memory management is drawing, what the engine spends time rendering for the player. Earlier this year, a Dutch documentary on the studio showed off its frustum culling, much to the wonder of the game-playing public. I asked Michiel to give us some insight into how that system works.
Yeah, first of all, like the whole frustum culling thing, it was really funny to see that explode, because I think it was a really good visualization of something that is like super normal in the graphics industry. I mean, of course, you don't draw stuff that's out of screen. This was not even about streaming, this was about drawing. You basically, of course, like you have a person somewhere in the world, if you're third person, you have a camera that's somewhere above probably, looking into the world, which is defined by something that ends up being square. So there's a point in space from which a sort of like square thing called a frustum, imagine everything that's outside of the frustum you don't have to draw. And then even the stuff that's inside the frustum, what you try to do is like draw the things that are quite close to you first, and then the stuff that's behind it, because you don't want to like draw a mountain and a bunch of trees on it, and then 5 characters in front of it, and then draw a house like 1 centimeter in front of you, because you're wasting all the time first drawing a beautiful mountain while you're drawing like a door in front of it. So you try to first draw the door, and then when you send the mountain to the GPU, it goes like, all those pixels are behind the door, like toss it out. It happened to be in a documentary and people saw that, and then people were like, all of a sudden they got it, like, that's what's really happening. Like, yeah, when that bunny hops off screen, immediately it's not gone, but of course we're not rendering it anymore.
Something this fundamental should have been done in the early stages of development, because it will inform all the other areas of the game's design. If we're lucky, it will be out by the end of this year, 6 years in. Second, make the game mechanics, flight modeling, and ship designs part of this new foundation laying phase. Building up a library of ships that are completed before you know how all the systems will work, where components will be, and how they will fly is asinine. Look at this example from Guerrilla Games and their latest work, Horizon Zero Dawn. This is their foundation and concepting phase for one of their big robot creatures. It is extremely rough and unfinished, but it is enough for them to test their ideas and see how various systems would work, in this case knocking off components from enemies. You're already able to see the different pieces the player is able to knock off during combat. Once the developers have a good idea how the creature will work in-game, then they develop the model towards the final asset, not before. They went from this to this very satisfying final product. With Star Citizen, the development has gone the opposite way, and the problems that design flow has caused are obvious. The flight model for the ships all feel pretty much the same, even regardless if the ship is 20 meters long or 100 plus. A YouTuber called Citizen Gamer has done a few videos on this topic, and while a couple of the specifics regarding physics are wrong, the base concept and solutions that they give are solid. Their videos delve deeper into why this issue exists in Star Citizen and related to how it can be fixed, giving practical examples from other games that use real physics, such as Kerbal Space Program or DCS World. They're good videos, and I've linked them in the description as well for you to check out. While Roberts has finally come out and said that flight is not where they want it to be, I'm not convinced they, 1, know where they want it to be, and 2, understand how to actually get there. That remains to be seen, as they've given no further information that I've seen since Chris had talked about his new top-level design ideas. A redefined scope and a proper foundation. 2 seemingly basic but incredibly important things that, if done properly, could help get this project back on the right path again. If CIG announced these kind of changes next month or next week with CitizenCon and actually stuck with them, do I think that would solve all the problems with development? At this stage, definitely not. There are things far too widespread and cluttered to really get back on track, already this far behind schedule. It also wouldn't be an answer or counter to all of the questionable funding practices, nor would it help restore the company and game's image to the general public. For those people that are still holding out for something great to finally come from this project, however, I think it could result in something that is at least mildly worthwhile. At this stage, I think that's all we can really hope for. Whew, thanks for sticking with me throughout this whole video. It was a long one, and honestly, it was really tough to write and keep things mostly clear, especially since I've never done a video essay like this before. Not only was it tough to write because of the sheer amount of content, but it was also easy to put off finishing because the next update may change things, which is honestly the same mentality that fans fall into for updates of the game. This update was a letdown, but the next one, that will solve everything. With CitizenCon around the corner, I decided that enough is enough. This finally needed to be finished. And again, I'm only scratching the surface of Star Citizen and the craziness surrounding this project. There's actually a lot more I wanted to cover, like going further in depth on the psychology of people who are staunch defenders of this game and how they exhibit similarities to Stockholm Syndrome, more criticism of CIG's actual game design, and how a lot of their ideas for the gameplay are just bad. I bet someone could write a whole thesis on the subject by the time some kind of release for the project actually happens. Also, just as an addendum, with the recent news of the essential closure of Telltale Games and so many developers being left jobless because of no fault of their own, I wanted to say how I believe the average worker at CIG are doing their best to make the game happen, and the blame for Star Citizen's development issues do not fall at their feet. It seems like there's some pretty good talent in the studio, but if the orders coming down from the top are bad, then there's not much the workers can do about that. I actually think I will do more video essays in the future, as I've really enjoyed creating this one. So if you want to see those, I guess you could subscribe or follow me on Twitch, because I stream on there sometimes. I'll actually be re-streaming CitizenCon this year with a critical commentary perspective on that, which if you like this video, you might enjoy that as well. I guess on Twitter, you could follow me there too if you want, but that's mostly just politics and memes, so you probably don't want that. Ugh. Oh yeah, put in a Patreon joke.